All right. So I think that the first chapter we're going to talk about concludes um, kind of the research area of this subject of crisis and trauma. And the second chapter begins the therapeutic process. And some of the types of therapy that they're talking about, I have training in, but others I don't. So, but I do understand what goes into them. And it's just because some of them require an extra certification. So, for instance, like EMDR, I was trained in EMDR in my doctoral program, but I'm not certified in EMDR. It's expensive, takes a lot of time. If I was going to get certified in something, it would be EMDR. So all right. So let's look at the last chapter in the research part, and it's chapter 12, The Unbearable Heaviness of Remembering. And if you remember, the last time we met, it kind of brought us up to the Paris School. And remember, we talked about all of the different individuals that started discovering various and categorizing various kinds of diagnoses, like Dr. Tourette and Genet and a few others, and how they talked about trauma. That was during the time of Freud and a little after. But this chapter continues that timeline and begins with World War One. So when we think about, Freud and the people who came immediately after Freud, World War One took place in the very early 1900s, 1917 or something like that. And it was a new kind of warfare. They had a lot of, perhaps you've seen the movie All Quiet on the Western Front. It's pretty famous. It's a book, it's a movie, old black and white movie. Now Netflix came out with a brand new movie, All Quiet on the Western Front. I watched it. It was pretty good. And even if you watched it's kind of the autobiography movie of Tolkien called Tolkien, it shows scenes from World War One in that movie as well. And one of the things that it's hard to grasp is the type of warfare. So we were halfway in between, I want to say, kind of more primitive warfare and modern warfare. It was the transitioning. And, they had just invented things like machine guns and poisonous gas and specifically mustard gas. Most of it was trench warfare. They're about 100 yards apart. So the thing with like mustard gas is heavier than air, so it always sinks to the lowest location wherever on a battlefield. So it would settle in the trenches, and the gas masks were not that advanced. They leaked. They only lasted for a short amount of time. Could really only use them once before you had to change the filter. And so you had a choice. You could risk your life in the trench, or you could leave the trench and get shot at. They also were in a constant struggle for gaining ground and moving forward. So the other thing that they invented was the type of shells that they used. During the Civil War, they did invent cannonballs that exploded, but these were much more advanced. They had more accurate trajectories. There was a lot more shrapnel. They were larger. They could go longer distances. And they had a much greater concussive impact and displacement. So there was a lot more pressure when they exploded. So that's why they use the term shell shocked, because when these shells exploded, if you were within range, you would probably get killed because of the shrapnel or the intensive impact. But if you were far enough away, you would survive, but the displacement in the atmosphere would basically throw you back, your body back, and it would impact your skull, and your brain would bounce off the front of your skull and hit the back of your skull. And that's called a contre coup. And so when that happens, you're dazed and confused, and it could cause permanent damage. And so there were a lot of famous individuals, famous psychiatrists and psychologists that served in World War I. Adler, Fritz Perls, and others. One of the things that they began to look at was soldiers that suffered from this type of injury. But at the same time, there's a lot of hand-to-hand combat. There's, death anxiety. There's all types of emotional trauma occurring as well. They're seeing friends being killed. There's killing other people. There's fear of oneself dying, and basically all the horrors of war that you could imagine. So one of the things these early psychologists had to take into consideration, and this is also why Fritz Perls calls his theory Gestalt theory, is Gestalt means whole. They had to look at the whole individual, not just the potential physical injury, but the emotional injury and trauma as well. And so it was most likely a combination of the two. However, a lot of times they could not tell if there was brain damage because, it was all still inside the skull, and they didn't know what brain damage had occurred as a result of these impacts. In World War I, the soldiers displayed symptomology that was, maybe just staring into space or flailing their bodies or becoming emotional, and not being able to function fully cognitively. Unfortunately, because they needed soldiers, they did away with that diagnosis. It wasn't a true diagnosis, but they would write it on their medical chart, shell shock. And they said no doctor can write that diagnosis on the medical chart anymore. And so they sent them, if they were somewhat functional, they would send them back into battle because they needed soldiers. So after World War I, came the Depression, and then about one generation later, World War II occurred. Very similar things happened. And, I told you the story. My dad served in World War II. He wasn't diagnosed. He probably had PTSD. They still use the term shell shock. But once again, they did not want to label somebody with that. They wanted to send them back into battle unless they had another physical injury. So not a lot was done with PTSD or being shell-shocked back then. They were also called the silent generation. And when we have to think about how people were brought up culturally, it was basically people didn't talk a lot about their experiences in the wars. They moved on with their lives. They kind of kept it to themselves and made the best of it. And the number one self-medication was alcohol, and the second one was tobacco, and it was probably a combination of both. So alcoholism rates were extremely high after both of those wars. The one thing that was tried was hypnosis, and the one thing that hypnosis can provide if used properly. So we talked about last time, you don't want to ask leading questions because you don't want to bring about false memories. However, one thing hypnosis can do is place people in a relaxed state so that they're no longer in that fight or flight mode. So that is one thing that it could provide. Let's see. So, the book talks about a quote that says, when the medical officers examined men exhibiting severe disturbances, they almost invariably found the root cause in pre-war experience. Sick men were not first-grade fighting material. The military proposition is that it's not war that makes men sick, but sick men can't fight wars. Well, we know that's false. I don't think that that's the case at all. And I think it, somewhat belittles people who have served. The other interesting thing is that the symptomology after World War II was somewhat different than the symptomology after World War I. So a lot of individuals in World War II complained about what we would now call psychosomatic symptomology. So pains, upset stomach, and now they theorize that the reason for that is if somebody was complaining about a physical reaction to PTSD, the doctors would focus on the physical symptomology and not the mental issues. So they would take x-rays, and the soldiers would see that, hey, I'm getting some type of care, I'm getting some type of response, maybe they'll be able to help me. But if they talked about their emotional struggles, it did not get the same reaction. And so it kind of perpetuated the psychosomatic symptomology rather than the emotional reactions. I think, and the book mentioned this a bit, that probably one of the largest changes came, you know, in the 1960s. And that's because of the feminist movement, the civil rights movement. There was a change in thinking, during that time, the 60s and the 70s. And, I think that between the feminist movement, the civil rights movement, those two movements combined really made a big change in the way we responded, not only to equality, but to healthcare as well. So I just want to reference one of the studies that I thought was pretty important. Linda Meyer Williams began when she was a graduate student in sociology at U of Penn in the early 1970s. She interviewed 206 girls between the age of 10 and 12 who had been admitted to a hospital emergency room following sexual abuse. And the laboratory test that followed confirmed it. 17 years later, so longitudinal study, 17 years later, she was able to track down 136 of these same individuals and followed up with them when they were adults. And in these interviews, more than a third of the women, 38%, did not recall the abuse that was documented in their medical records, while only 15 women, 12%, said that they had never been abused as children. More than 2/3, 68%, reported other incidents of childhood sexual abuse. Women who were younger at the time of the incident and those who were molested by someone they knew were more likely to have forgotten their abuse. So the whole purpose of including that, and I don't know if they anticipated those results or not, was basically repressing those memories. I know that when I just started being a counselor, I wasn't sure what to think about repressed memory. But when I started working with children who were abused, using play therapy, as time went by and as they began to feel safe in the play therapy environment and they began to trust me, they would begin to regress to the age that they had first been abused. So, and they would begin to reenact things that a child would do at that age. It could be, holding a blanket and sucking their thumb. It could be anything like that, but they would look at me and as if, can I act this age? Is it okay? And I said, yes, you can do whatever you want. It's your playroom. And, so the interesting thing is that they would regress to that age and then they would be able to express memories that they had never talked about before after they acted out whatever happened in that age. The other thing that happened was that they would often act out something healthy and normal that would occur in that age. And it allowed them to move through that stage of development in a positive way whereas previously they might have encountered an impasse because of the abuse, and they moved on to the next stage in the playroom. So, I totally believe in this now because I was able to witness it and help kids to work through these things. I think the author goes into different types of memory recall, and I still do think that hypnosis is not an appropriate way to bring back memories because it can be leading. You really have to be trained in how to ask a totally open-ended question so that you don't give someone a prompt. But I totally think that memories can be repressed, that they can come back naturally, that they can come back in therapy, and that they can come back in both flashbacks and bits and pieces of memory. I think it's happens more often in that case of Julian, like if somebody sees something on the news, like he saw that priest who had abused him being tried for sexual abuse. I think that's often how it occurs, that something triggers a flashback, and then that flashback eventually expands into a more comprehensive memory at a later age. There's an interesting section on the Holocaust survivors. So I encourage you to read that. There's a book called The Holocaust Testimonies, The Ruins of Memory. And sometimes things are, I don't even know, so horrific, and they go on for such an extended period of time that people can't even express what occurred so that they can share the story. So they totally separate themselves or dissociate themselves from those experiences, even though they can either repress or retain the memories. So if somebody was in a concentration camp for months or a year, it's most likely that they would not repress a year, but that they would disconnect from that in order to move on with their lives after they were released. So it's almost as if in the memory, they're remembering a different person who experienced that. And that's the only way that they can separate themselves and stop the re-experiencing of those emotions of that horrific time period. And so, one of the goals would be to reconnect, but only after. I think one of the big mistakes that therapists make when treating trauma is to jump into recall too soon. Well, can you tell me what happened? That's probably not the first thing you want to ask unless you're in an emergency room setting and need it for legal documents. But in therapy, you don't want to re-traumatize them in that therapeutic environment, or it will no longer be a safe environment. And then and then he told Nancy's story, which is anesthesia awareness. And that's when somebody is on an operating table, placed under anesthesia, they're paralyzed because of the anesthesia, but their mind is awake so they can feel the pain. They can hear what's happening, but they can't speak, they can't move. And, imagine going through an operation and, not being able to escape. It would be like a torture chamber. So that never happened to me, but I have experienced sleep paralysis. Has anybody else experienced sleep paralysis? So sleep paralysis is when you're just sleeping like at a normal night, but when it's time to wake up in the morning, or maybe before your normal time of waking, maybe you're woke up at a different time, but your mind wakes up before your body wakes up. And so it's like I was awake, but I couldn't move my body. And, then I had like a racing heart and I felt trapped. And even though it was only a few seconds, it seemed like an extended period of time. And then your body catches up, your body kicks in some adrenaline, and your body's able to move, and then everything's normal again. But it's a frightening experience because I didn't know what was happening. And it's almost claustrophobic, even though I wasn't in an enclosed space. So then, of course, I did research. I'm like, hey, this is sleep paralysis. I was hoping it never would happen again, but it did happen one other time, a few months later. But I was able to tell myself, this is sleep paralysis. It'll be over in a few seconds. And so I no longer had that emotional reaction to that experience because I understood what was happening. They don't know what exactly causes that. It never happened again. It only happened those 2 times to me. But it's the closest I could come empathically to, being under anesthesia. The other time is like maybe you've had an operation where they call it putting you in twilight. And so you're not fully asleep, you're only in twilight. And so many people have different experiences. So like when I had my cataracts removed, I was awake, but I was given anesthesia that would place me in twilight. And, so I'm talking with this surgeon about how high Mount Lebanon taxes we're getting. But, people talk about crazy stuff too, because they're a little loopy. I talk about taxes when I'm loopy, I guess. Has anybody else had any of these experiences?
The C-section, but I was awake for it, but they cut you open during.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yanked the baby out. That didn't feel very comfortable.
Yeah. Put everything back where it's supposed to be. So, any reaction or any questions or response to that chapter? All right, well, it's about 5 till 8, so we'll take a 10-minute break. We'll come back and we'll start on our therapeutic chapters.